April 12, 1944. Somewhere in rural Arkansas, United States. A column of weary German prisoners trudged along the muddy road, their boots sinking into the earth with every step. The air smelled faintly of rain and freshly cut grass, a sharp contrast to the smoke and decay of the battlefields they had just left behind. Oberleutnant Karl Weber, a veteran of campaigns across France and the Eastern Front, squinted through the drizzle, expecting barbed wire cages, shouting guards, and the cold sting of hunger. Instead, what greeted him was a scene so surreal that for a moment he doubted his own senses. The camp gates rose like welcoming arms, adorned not with propaganda banners or armed sentries bristling with rifles, but with neatly trimmed hedges and rows of whitewashed barracks. American soldiers, young men barely out of high school, stood at attention, their rifles slung loosely over their shoulders, offering curt nods rather than the barking commands Weber had anticipated. The prisoners shuffled through the gates, eyes scanning the orderly grounds, noticing the vegetable gardens, small recreation areas, and the low hum of activity that resembled a small, functioning town more than a prison. In the mess hall, Weber's expectations collapsed entirely. Steel trays were lined with steaming portions of roast beef, mashed potatoes, and fresh vegetables. Hot coffee steamed in urns that had been polished to a shine, and a faint aroma of baked bread filled the air. The German soldiers, conditioned by months of deprivation and the brutality of war, stared at the food as if it were a hallucination. Unteroffizier Hans Meyer, who had fought across Russia and seen the worst of Stalingrad's winter, whispered to his friend, "They can't feed us like this. It's impossible." The Americans moved with quiet efficiency, serving meals with a formality and care that contrasted with the harsh urgency of the front lines they had known. Even the living quarters defied expectation. Each barrack was heated, beds made with crisp linens, and there were simple amenities, books, radios, and a small infirmary staffed by nurses who treated even minor ailments with attention and professionalism. Prisoners were allowed daily walks within the perimeter, supervised but not restricted to strict formations. Weber noticed a group of men playing chess near the recreation hall, laughing quietly, their tension temporarily lifted. The Geneva Convention standards were being observed not just in letter, but with a sense of conscientious hospitality. Yet, beneath the surface of calm, disbelief ran deep. How could this be real? How could the men responsible for their capture treat them with such civility? Weber observed the young American guards moving among the prisoners, answering questions patiently, assisting where needed. It was a world away from the fear and suspicion of occupied France or the frozen landscapes of Russia. In hushed tones, prisoners began to compare notes: the hot coffee, the fresh meat, even the cleanliness of the latrines. It was all astonishing. For many, this was the first time they felt anything resembling safety in years. The psychological shock was profound. Weber caught himself imagining life back home, where rations were scarce, and wondered how anyone could maintain morale under such conditions. He realized that while war had taken much from them, territory, comrades, pride, the Americans had found a way to treat captives with a surprising degree of humanity, forcing even hardened soldiers to reconsider what they believed possible in a world defined by conflict. The morning sun broke through a patchwork of clouds over Camp White Sulphur Springs, casting a warm glow on the gravel paths that wound between the barracks. Oberleutnant Weber rubbed his eyes, still unconvinced that the previous day's experiences were anything but a strange dream. As the prisoners lined up for morning roll call, he noticed something unusual. The guards were not barking orders or enforcing harsh discipline. Instead, they counted heads with a calm efficiency, occasionally offering a word of encouragement or answering a soldier's question about daily routine. Private First Class James Thompson, a young guard with freckles and an easy smile, had been assigned to Weber's barrack. Thompson was barely 20, A farm boy drafted into the army the previous year, yet he carried out his duties with a quiet professionalism. "Make sure you eat your breakfast," he said, almost casually, as he handed out trays. "You'll need the energy for work details later." Weber blinked. Work details? The thought of manual labor under American supervision had him bracing for punishment. But what awaited the prisoners was something different entirely.
They were assigned to tend gardens, repair camp buildings, and even assist in small administrative tasks. The work was purposeful but not grueling, and it provided a sense of routine missing from the chaos of the battlefield. For many POWs, this was the first time in years they felt productive, without fear of immediate death or punishment. Corporal Heinrich Braun, who had fought through Italy and witnessed countless atrocities, remarked quietly to his friend, "I never imagined they'd let us move freely, even work, as if we were normal men." Meals continued to astonish. Fresh meat, often roast pork or beef, accompanied by seasonal vegetables and warm bread, were served with a regularity and abundance unimaginable on the European front. Coffee was not just a warm beverage, but a symbol of stability, offered in generous mugs that the prisoners held with both hands, savoring the flavor as if it were a luxury from another world. Even desserts appeared, simple cakes, fruit preserves, and puddings, each meal reinforcing the surreal nature of the camp. Medical care further demonstrated the unexpected humanity of American captivity. Any sickness or injury, from minor colds to battle wounds, was treated promptly. Nurses moved quietly through the infirmary, administering care without judgment, their professionalism emphasizing that these men, former enemies, were still human beings deserving of attention. Weber watched a stretcher being wheeled through the hall, carrying a soldier with a sprained ankle. The orderly whispered instructions to the attending nurse, and she smiled gently at the patient. It was a level of compassion that the German soldiers could hardly reconcile with their conceptions of wartime treatment. Outside the barracks, life carried a semblance of normalcy. Men strolled along the tree-lined paths, some reading books provided by the camp library, others playing chess or cards. Laughter, cautious but genuine, echoed between the buildings, a sound that had been absent for years. Weber found himself pausing to listen, realizing that for the first time since the war began, fear was not the constant companion. Even in the context of imprisonment, the POWs were allowed small freedoms that restored dignity and reminded them of life beyond the battlefield. The psychological impact was profound. Soldiers hardened by years of combat, who had expected brutality and deprivation, were now confronted with the stark contrast of American kindness. Weber noted the disbelief etched on the faces of his fellow prisoners. Eyes wide at the abundance of food, hands hesitant when reaching for fresh fruit, murmured conversations questioning the authenticity of their treatment. It was a daily struggle to reconcile years of wartime conditioning with this reality of humane captivity. By the second week at Camp White Sulphur Springs, the German POWs began to notice the rhythm of life, a daily routine that was orderly, purposeful, and above all, humane. Reveille came promptly at 6 a.m., but instead of the harsh shouts and drills of the battlefield, a gentle bugle call stirred the prisoners from sleep. Barracks were inspected not to punish, but to maintain cleanliness and organization. Beds were made, floors swept, and uniforms inspected with a quiet thoroughness that encouraged pride rather than fear. Breakfast followed shortly, and Weber and his comrades marveled at the consistency. Plates of eggs, bacon, and steaming coffee appeared on polished tables. Occasionally, a small treat, jam, fruit, or a slice of cake, was included, a gesture that seemed almost personal. Weber noticed that even the smallest details mattered. Napkins were folded, utensils polished, and the servers moved with a calm, purposeful precision. Every meal was an event, and it reinforced the sense that the captives were being treated with dignity and respect. Work details soon became a highlight rather than a chore. The prisoners tended vegetable gardens, repaired camp fences, and assisted with maintenance of the barracks. Each task was assigned with clear instruction and supervision, but without harassment. For men like Unteroffizier Hans Meyer, who had spent years on forced marches and grueling frontline duties, the physical activity was surprisingly restorative. He found satisfaction in seeing gardens flourish under his care, as if he were contributing to a world that had not yet been consumed by war.
Even leisure activities were integrated into daily life. Mornings or afternoons often included sports, chess, and card games. Reading rooms offered novels, newspapers, and even American magazines, allowing POWs to glimpse life beyond the camp. The recreational activities were more than distraction. They became a balm for the mental scars of combat. Weber observed men laughing quietly, their faces softening after weeks of grim determination and fear. The realization that enemies could coexist peacefully, even briefly, in this controlled environment was disorienting, yet profoundly impactful. Medical care continued to impress the prisoners. Any illness or injury was treated promptly and without question. Weber witnessed nurses attend to small injuries with a kindness that contrasted sharply with the crude first aid often administered at the front. Even dental care was provided, a luxury most men had not seen for years. For the first time, prisoners were not forced to endure suffering silently. The adherence to the Geneva Convention was evident in every interaction. It was not simply protocol, but a genuine effort to maintain the humanity of the captives. The shock of this treatment weighed heavily on the men. Their minds struggled to reconcile the fact that they were prisoners, yet their captors treated them with a level of consideration that rivaled what civilians might experience in peacetime. Conversations in the barracks often revolved around disbelief. How could this be real? Was it possible that an army could fight with such ferocity abroad and still maintain such civility at home? For Weber, the question lingered in every interaction. Was this treatment a reflection of American character or a tactical move to foster compliance? In truth, it was both. The camp's operations combined strict adherence to regulations with genuine attention to prisoner welfare. Every detail, from food to recreation, from work assignments to medical care, was carefully designed to maintain morale, ensure compliance, and inadvertently reshape perceptions of the enemy. For German soldiers hardened by years of war, the experience was transformative. They began to realize that captivity in America could be a strange kind of sanctuary, where survival was guaranteed and dignity preserved. By the third week, the German POWs began to notice subtler aspects of camp life, those small gestures that revealed the humanity behind the uniform. Oberleutnant Weber observed the interactions between prisoners and their guards with growing fascination. It wasn't just that the guards refrained from cruelty. Many engaged in friendly conversation, offering advice on work tasks, suggesting ways to improve garden yields, or simply asking about life back in Germany. The tone was never condescending, but consistently respectful, creating an unexpected bridge between captor and captive. Weber found himself assigned to the camp library one afternoon, organizing books and records. Private Thompson, the young American guard, passed by and offered a quiet smile. "You might like this one," he said, pointing to a German-language novel that had been donated by a local family. It was a small gesture, almost trivial, yet for Weber, it carried profound meaning. Here, in the middle of rural Arkansas, the young man was acknowledging his enemy not as a faceless soldier, but as a person with thoughts, interests, and feelings. Letters home became a lifeline. The U.S. military encouraged prisoners to write, and letters were delivered promptly. For many, it was the first reliable contact with family since capture. Weber's own letter, addressed to his mother in Hamburg, described the shock of seeing hot meals and clean barracks, of being allowed to tend a garden, read a book, or walk freely under the watchful eye of a polite guard. He struggled to put into words the surreal blend of gratitude, disbelief, and shame. Shame that he had expected hostility, and gratitude that it had not arrived. Even casual encounters revealed surprising camaraderie. In the evenings, some prisoners would gather near the recreation hall to play chess, a game that transcended language barriers. Guards sometimes watched silently, occasionally offering advice or moving a piece with a gentle comment. Laughter, once forbidden in the chaos of war, now echoed across the courtyard. Weber noticed that as days passed, tension softened, and the men began to reclaim small parts of their humanity that had been eroded by years of violence. This humane treatment had strategic consequences too. The Americans understood that prisoners who felt respected were more likely to comply with camp rules and less likely to attempt escape. Yet, beyond strategy, the effect on the POW's psyche was undeniable. Weber saw men talking quietly about their homes, sharing memories of childhoods interrupted by war, or discussing trivial hobbies that had long been forgotten. In those moments, the divide between enemy and ally blurred, replaced by something uniquely human: recognition, understanding, and the simple desire for dignity. Even officers like Weber, who had been skeptical and hardened by years on the Eastern Front, felt a subtle shift in perspective. He observed the guards with a mixture of wariness and awe, realizing that these young Americans had been trained for combat, yet chose patience and civility in dealing with men who had fought against them. The contrast was stark and inescapable, leaving an impression that would linger long after the war ended. By the end of the first month, the initial disbelief of the German prisoners had begun to settle into a quiet, reflective acceptance. Oberleutnant Weber often found himself walking along the gravel paths in the late afternoon, watching the sunlight filter through the trees, illuminating the neatly arranged barracks and orderly gardens. It was a world so different from the chaos of the European front that it almost felt unreal. He thought about the soldiers he had fought alongside, who had endured hunger, mud, and constant fear. Men who would have given anything for a single hot meal or a clean bed. And here he was, as a prisoner, receiving such care without question. Conversations in the barracks increasingly revolved around comparisons to life at home. The POWs, once bitter and defensive, began to acknowledge that the Americans' adherence to Geneva Convention standards went far beyond mere obligation. They marveled at the meticulous attention to detail in every part of camp life, from medical care and recreation to the quality and regularity of meals. Many admitted to one another that, in their years of fighting, they had never encountered such kindness from an enemy. Even the guards' casual gestures of respect, the offering of advice, polite conversation, or a simple smile, were enough to unsettle the prisoners' preconceived notions about their captors. Weber's reflections often turned inward. How could such generosity exist amidst the destruction of war? How could a nation capable of overwhelming industrial might and fierce combat maintain a level of civility toward those it had captured? These questions lingered in his mind, challenging his understanding of morality, discipline, and human decency. He realized that the American approach to captivity was not merely compliance with international law, it was a deliberate cultivation of trust, order, and humanity, even in the heart of conflict. The shock, however, was not only psychological, but deeply emotional. Soldiers like Unteroffizier Hans Meyer admitted privately that they felt guilt, shame even, for expecting cruelty or preparing themselves to endure harsh treatment. Their years on the battlefield had hardened them to brutality, yet the Americans' hospitality forced them to confront the humanity they had buried within themselves. Letters sent home reflected a mixture of astonishment and gratitude, describing a world of hot coffee, fresh meat, comfortable beds, and surprising freedoms. Details that many families could hardly believe until they received the correspondence. By the time Weber and his fellow POWs had been in the camp for several months, a subtle transformation had taken place. The shock of American generosity had given way to respect, a grudging admiration for the organization, discipline, and civility that defined the camp. Soldiers who had once viewed their captors with suspicion and resentment now acknowledged the profound contrast between life at the front and life within the neatly maintained confines of the Arkansas camp. In many ways, the experience reshaped their understanding of what it meant to be human in the midst of war. leaving an indelible mark that would survive long after the guns had fallen silent.